The horses don't slow when the king's mouth slackens and his right hand drops like a dead weight. Leather harness creaks, hooves drum a dull thunder into wet summer earth, and a hot animal stink seeps into the coach. You are riding beside the door, close enough to see the left side of his face twist into the expression the court physicians will name with care, a stroke. The window rattles, sweat and rain bead on the painted panels. Somewhere between Delden and Nordhorn, the King of Great Britain is sliding out of his body, and the road keeps tugging the carriage toward Osnabrück. You count breaths without meaning to. You count hoofbeats. You count the miles to a palace bedroom before dawn, where a candle gutter will mark the last exhale and the first silence. And you are there for all of it. You are not a tourist in time. You are a witness? If careful history told in a quiet, unblinking voice is valuable to you, subscribe and like. There's no spectacle here, only what can be traced, dates, places, bodies, and the hush that follows. Stay, and we will follow the road to Osnabrück, to a brother's palace, and to a coffin bound for Hanover after the crown has already passed. If that steadiness is the kind of truth you want in your feed, you'll know what to do. It is June 1727. The first Hanoverian king of Great Britain and Ireland is on the familiar road back to the German lands that shaped him long before Westminster crowned him. You are a mounted courier in the royal party, mud on your boots, a leather pouch at your hip. The sort of shadow a moving monarch depends on. The route has its rhythm, channel winds, level Dutch roads, and then the older bishopric tracks where milestones still remember Roman feet. George Lewis, George I to London, has done this many times. Since 1714 he has divided his year between island and electorate. A sovereign who never spoke English with ease and relied on ministers who could translate policy into votes. The arrangement held because the law held. A Protestant succession written into statute after Queen Anne, and a king whose true home still lay east of the Channel. But any convoy behind a king drags more than trunks. It pulls the unresolved weight of a family and a dynasty. Behind him trail a son who distrusts him and will become George II within hours, an estranged consort. Sophia Dorothea of Celle, divorced in 1694 and confined at Alden for the rest of her life after the scandal of Count Philip Christoph von Königsmarck's disappearance, and a court that learned to serve a ruler across languages. Those are not fireside inventions. The imprisonment at Alden is a matter of record. And the murder of Königsmarck a black gap in the sources that never quite closed. Eastward lies the Prince-Bishopric of Osnabrück, where George's younger brother, Ernest Augustus, soldier and prelate, holds office and keeps a palace suited to ceremony. It is toward that palace the couriers point their horses when something goes wrong on the road, a blow. Schlag, as the German grooms call it. In later summaries you can read the dates like tidy account entries. The incident between Delden and Nordhorn on the 9th of June. The king carried on to Osnabrück, and death in the small hours before dawn on the 11th of June by local reckoning. The 22nd of June New Style. At his brother's residence. What makes this journey frightening is not secrecy but certainty. There is no poisoned cup, no midnight assassin. There is a failing body in a moving coach. A narrowing of the world to breath and pulse while rank and ritual cling like wet cloth. Your work is simpler and heavier than a minister's. Keep the horses shod. The messages carried. The doorway clear when the physicians arrive. The rest is observation and ink. London will learn by relays. Hanover will prepare a vault at Leineschloss, as the family always has. History will add that after a later war burns the old palace. The coffins will be moved to the chapel at Herrenhausen. But for now there is only a road, a convulsion, and the measured pace of ceremony when a monarch's body begins to fail. You ride ahead when the order comes to clear the road. The sky is low, wool gray, spitting a fine rain that turns dust to paste. Between Delden and Nordhorn the track narrows between hedges, and every rut reaches for the coach wheels. Behind you the royal carriage grinds and sways, its varnished panels dulled by a film of grit and wet. A messenger has already gone to Osnabrück with instructions. Prepare a chamber in the prince-bishop's palace. Light braziers. Find physicians. Heat bricks. Lay clean linen. No one says dying. They say the king is unwell. The king is fatigued. The king must not be jostled. They say, above all, keep moving. At a shallow ford the horses shy at a floating branch, and you glimpse the king through the open door. The left eye is bright and painfully alert. The mouth draws to one side. The right hand lies slack upon a travel rug that still smells of lanolin and smoke. A footman steadies the drooping cheek with 2 fingers and whispers a question that comes out in German and goes unanswered in any language. The grooms mutter Schlag, blow, while the door is shut again and the coach rolls on. Its lanterns tapping under the axles like muffled clocks. By nightfall the convoy reaches the bishopric town. Towers huddle out of the weather. The river breathes a damp chill through courtyard arches. The palace of Ernest Augustus rises with the solemn thrift of a house that keeps more ceremony than heat. Torches throw puddles of light across the flagstones and paint long, wavering shadows up the walls. Chamberlains bow and back away. Maids hurry under the weight of bolsters. A priest is shown to an antechamber and told to wait. The king is carried in on a chair because stairs make a mockery of sovereignty. And you learn how quiet a palace can be when everyone is listening to the same failing breath. Physicians arrive with leather cases and powdered wigs. Their faces professionally grave. They are not fools. They know what a drooping mouth means. They know the language of a limp right hand and a voice that catches and dissolves into syllables without shape. They warm cloths. They test the skin with a pin. They hold a feather to the lips and watch it twitch like a needle. They speak in a careful braid of German, French, and Latin that maps their training more than their certainty. Somewhere in their talk is a word that sparks and fades, apoplexy, and no one uses the other word that a groom already dared, stroke. The king does not recover. When he tries to sit, his breath snarls into a wet rattle and he sinks back, furious only in the eyes. His left hand still claws at the coverlet with a stubborn, animal vigor. The right lies obedient to nothing. He attempts a name, perhaps of a place, perhaps of a person, and the sound emerges as a moist fragment. Half a word that finds no landing. He stares beyond you at a tapestry hunt where stitched hounds chase stitched deer forever and catch nothing. The candles smoke in their brass cups. The room smells of tallow and damp wool and something faintly sweet. That sickroom odor which tells you a body is busy with endings. It is still dark when the breathing changes. It stutters, halts, resumes in a smaller version of itself, and then thins to a thread you could almost pinch in two. The attending physician places 2 fingers at the neck, counts against the slow tick of the bishop's clock, and waits through that terrible silence in which men choose between hope and truth. The final exhalation comes like a surrender. He nods once. The nod moves outward through the chamber, into a strangled sob. A priest's whispered Latin, the soft scrape of a chair leg across stone, and the quiet that follows feels like a verdict written in air. Afterward, the rituals begin because they must. The face is straightened as best anyone can manage. The jaw bound with a strip of linen. The body turned with practiced hands while the sheets are changed. The curtains are drawn though the day outside is gray and without glare. A clerk takes down the particulars with an ink that smudges in the damp. The place. The hour before dawn. The witnesses. Another clerk copies the message for London. It is all there in as few words as possible. The king has died at Osnabrück, at his brother's palace, and the succession passes without a breath's delay. The palace wakes in layers. In the kitchens the living occupy themselves with pots and knives because the living must eat. In the stables the ostlers curry horses whose ears flick restlessly at the change they cannot name. At the door of the bedchamber 2 guards stand as if they could keep the change from leaking under the threshold. You walk into the courtyard and taste air that is part rain, part horse, part iron. Your mind puts the world into rows. Things to be saddled, letters to be sealed, men to be told and told again until the words stay put. A bell rings in a church that has rung for births and storms and rumors. A merchant folds his ledger and whispers the new king's name as if trying it on for fit. A boy presses close to the palace gate until a soldier's halberd nudges him back into the square. London will learn quickly by relays. But the first truth is here in the cold room where candles sputter and a tapestry stag runs forever. The physician seals his notes with wax and ribbon. The priest, who was told to wait, is told now to pray aloud. The prayers fill the corners the smoke has not yet found. There is talk already of the road to Hanover. The family vault in the chapel at Leinschloss can be opened. Men of rank must stand watch in turns. Orders are drafted for a measured procession. You are sent to check the harness and count the spare shoes. To arrange men who will walk at the wheel hubs and men who will clear the verges. You nod to the German carpenter who has measured an English king. And you try not to think of the weight of a lead-lined box when the weather sucks at your boots and every axle groans like an aged rib. For a moment, quiet returns. Ernest Augustus comes at last. The younger brother made grayer by offices and winter campaigns. And stands beside the bed. He does not touch the face. He looks once at the window, once at the clock, and once at the strip of white linen that keeps the jaw at rest. He nods to the physician, to the priest, and then to you, not because he knows you, but because the room requires acknowledgement all the way out to its edges. Somewhere in the palace a page drops a ewer, and the crash rings like a bell that cannot decide whether it calls to prayer or to work. Outside the town the wet road waits, indifferent, as it waited yesterday and the year before that. The coach horses stamp and toss their manes, sensing only that the cargo within is altered in kind, not in weight. You swing into the saddle because that is what the living do while the wax on a seal cools. History, at this distance, is leather to be oiled, hooves to be picked, orders to be carried without embellishment. The king is gone. The convoy will move. In the damp hall the candles hiss, and the woven hounds in the tapestry keep running. Rain keeps falling softly. The coffin is sealed before dawn on the 12th of June. Lead and oak. One to hold weight. One to hold form. The carpenters tap each nail as if it might echo back from the afterlife. You stand by while they work, your breath making small clouds in the corridor air, and listen to the hollow ring of hammer on lid. When the last seam is soldered and cooled, a velvet pall is drawn over the box, stitched with a faint crown that gleams in the torchlight. They say the road must be clear by sunrise. They say the new king will already be proclaimed before the old one's body leaves Osnabrück. Outside, the carriages line up in order of rank. First the heralds, then the clergy, then the wagon that bears the coffin beneath layers of cloth. Horses shift uneasily, sensing that this load smells wrong, resin, wax, and something faintly metallic, the scent of sealed decay. The morning air is thick with mist that turns torches into blurred halos. The procession starts slow, each hoofbeat absorbed by the wet road. No one speaks. You ride near the front, the reins slick in your palms, and listen to the rhythm of hooves, 4 for the living, none for the dead. At Nordhorn, the town bells ring once and then stop, as if sound itself has knelt. Villagers stand bareheaded by the roadside. Children peek from behind skirts, craning to glimpse what royalty looks like after the breath is gone. An old woman crosses herself in the Catholic way. A Protestant pastor bows without words. The coffin passes, and the air fills with a momentary gust that smells of rain, earth, and the faint sulfur from the blacksmith's forge. The king is going home, though the word, home, has more geography than comfort in it. By midday the sun breaks through a wound in the clouds, and steam rises from the soaked fields. The men riding beside you ease their cloaks off their shoulders, their faces pinked by heat. Someone mutters about the absurdity of flesh, how it rots, how it weighs the same whether it carries a crown or not. The remark earns him a glare but no rebuke. Death flattens protocol. Behind you, the wagon creaks, its axles moaning like an old organ. Every turn of the wheel pulls a ribbon of sound across the countryside. And you think of how far that sound has to travel before it reaches Hanover. At dusk, the convoy stops near Minden. A tavern has been cleared for the escort. Candles flicker in pewter holders. A loaf of bread sits untouched on the table. You watch the soldiers eat mechanically, chewing without taste. The air inside smells of smoke, sweat, and horses, the living insisting upon themselves. Outside, in a separate room, the coffin rests under guard. When you push open the door, a colder air brushes your face. The windows are shuttered, but you can hear flies whispering somewhere near the seam of the lid. One of the guards stands stiffly, eyes fixed on nothing. He says he thought he heard breathing a few hours ago. You don't laugh. At first light, the procession moves again. Osnabrück fades behind, its spires swallowed by haze. The countryside opens wide, rolling meadows, low villages, the scattered trees of Westphalia bending under weight of morning wind. The convoy slows often for ruts and broken bridges. At one crossing, the rear wheel sinks deep into mud, and men are called to lift while priests murmur prayers. The coffin tilts, a faint dull thud inside, and the line of horses shivers. For a second, everyone is silent, listening, as though expecting the king to protest. Then the ropes hold, the wagon rights itself. The road continues. News travels faster than the convoy. In Hanover, the Electress Sophia's portrait has already been draped in black. The court prepares the chapel at Leinenschloss. Couriers gallop ahead with letters sealed in black wax. One reports that George II received word in Kensington and wept, not for reconciliation, but for the formal end of rebellion between father and son. You will later learn that his tears were brief, drowned by ceremony, but that he ordered mourning without delay. The machinery of monarchy does not stop to grieve, it only changes uniforms. The border of Hanover is reached on the third day. The rain returns, heavier now, hammering on the canvas cover. You smell the water pooling on the cloth, the horse sweat, the iron tang of damp wheels. Villagers line the verges with torches despite the weather. They kneel in mud, bowing their heads as the procession passes. Somewhere a woman sings a Lutheran hymn, thin, almost breaking, about the fleetingness of life and the constancy of God. Her voice threads through the rain like smoke. That night, the cortege halts at the small town of Nienberg. The coffin is placed in a church for vigil. Candles surround it in concentric rings, and the wax melts faster than it can be trimmed. You kneel among guards who barely keep their eyes open. Each drip of wax sounds like water falling from a cave roof. You watch the brass fittings of the coffin dull under soot. Time itself seems to soften around the edges, as if even hours respect the gravity of a sealed box. By the next morning, a faint odor rises from the seams, a sweetness mixed with something acrid, like burnt almonds. The physician traveling with the party notes it quietly in his ledger. The king's body beginning to alter. They sprinkle more resin and change the wrappings, though everyone knows it makes no difference. The body of a monarch decays like any other. The scent clings to your gloves for days. On the fifth day, you see the spires of Hanover. Flags hang at half-mast, heavy with rain. The Leinenschloss stands by the river, its facade reflected in dark, rippling water. Crowds gather in silence along the bridges. You dismount and walk the rest of the way. Inside the palace courtyard, everything has been prepared. The chapel draped in black, the bier raised upon marble steps, the choir ready with psalms in Low German. The coffin is borne inside under a canopy of sable and gold fringe. Bells toll, low and deliberate, 12 strokes that vibrate through the stone floor beneath your boots. As the lid is lifted one final time for verification, you see what remains. The face is waxen, features slackened by both stroke and death. One eyelid droops half open, showing a dull glassiness beneath. The skin around the mouth is mottled greenish-gray. Someone murmurs that the likeness is preserved. Another quickly closes the lid. You notice the physician pressing herbs around the edges, a futile courtesy against time. The ceremony proceeds with brutal precision. Psalm chapter 39 echoes through the nave, Lord, make me to know mine end, and the measure of my days. The choir's voices rise and fall like a tide against stone. The archbishop reads the commendation. Pages lift candles in unison. When the pallbearers move, the sound of their boots against flagstone merges with the organ's drone. The coffin descends into the vault built for kings who seldom smiled and never rested. Dust billows, settles, and the final stone is rolled across the opening. You step back as the air grows still again. The sound of the mechanism fades, replaced by the faint hiss of tallow candles. The bishop's chamberlain notes the hour. You find yourself staring at the flag covering the tomb, white cross on red ground. The arms of Hanover, its fabric barely stirring in the draught. The monarch who divided his life between islands now divides his death between languages and calendars. The record will read, George I died the 11th of June 1727, Old Style the 21st of June. Osnabrück, buried at Hanover, king no longer, elector forever. Later, when the vault is closed and the keys hung on their pegs, the palace resumes its other business. Servants sweep corridors, clerks copy the announcements. You walk to the river and watch the current carry reeds past the arches of the bridge. Somewhere downstream the water will mingle with the Weser, then with the sea, where it will forget whose reflection it once held. You rub your hands, but the smell of resin and lead remains. In the weeks to come, newspapers will print clean versions of what you saw. His Majesty was seized with an apoplectic stroke and expired peacefully at Osnabrück. The word peacefully will offend you for the rest of your life. There was nothing peaceful about that body in the coach, about the stammered breath, the twisted mouth, the journey home through rot and rain. Yet history prefers symmetry over smell. It will write the man into calmness, and the century will turn another page. You linger by the chapel one last evening. The lamps flicker against the stone, throwing uneven shadows over the carved arms of the dynasty. Somewhere beneath your feet lies the lead box. Quiet now, cooling in its permanent dark. The prayers above are all ready for the next rain. Outside, the rain begins again, soft, persistent, and without memory. In London, the news arrived before the mourning cloth could even be hung in Hanover. Couriers had crossed the channel, their saddles still slick with North Sea spray, and by the morning of June 21st, the announcement reached Kensington. You imagine the paper, creased, wet around the edges, placed silently into the hands of George Augustus. Now George II, his eyes skim the lines once, then twice. He sets the note down without ceremony. The courtiers who watched said he stood for a long time in front of the window, the light making a ghost of his reflection against the glass. No tears, only a tightening of the jaw. That brittle dignity men inherit from fathers they never forgave. The city woke to bells, slow, deliberate, heavy with official grief. Black drapery was hung from church doors. In Westminster, ministers discussed succession as if death were an administrative inconvenience. The king is dead. Long live the king. The phrase spread through the streets like a breath carried by wind. You picture the clerks copying proclamations, their quills trembling slightly, not from sorrow but from haste. Somewhere in the exchange between parchment and ink, one monarch's life became another monarch's reign. George I's death was reported as peaceful, sudden, and free of scandal. It was none of these things. Apoplexy, the term physicians favored, was a polite veil for rupture, a bleeding inside the brain that left one side of the body useless and speech tangled beyond recognition. Accounts from Osnabrück mention the twisted mouth, the rattled breathing, the convulsions that made servants avert their eyes. Yet London preferred its king dignified, preserved in marble calm. The official bulletins avoided words like stroke or collapse. History, even then, understood the value of editing. As the court went into mourning, whispers followed like a shadow. Some said his death was divine retribution, a judgment for the long imprisonment of his wife, Sophia Dorothea of Celle. She had died just 9 months earlier, alone in the castle at Alden where she had been confined for 33 years. Allowed no visitors but servants and wardens. Locals recalled the windows nailed shut, the lamps burning through the night, and the silence that hovered over her quarters. When news of her death reached George, He was said to have turned pale, muttering that soon they would meet again. Those who believed in curses saw his stroke as proof. You have seen too much of the body to believe in curses. Yet the symmetry is difficult to ignore. In Hanover, the burial rites ended, but the gossip did not. Pamphleteers printed coarse verses mocking the king's German habits, his accent, his awkwardness among the English. Others mourned sincerely, remembering his steadiness after the chaos of the Stuart line. Better a dull peace than a brilliant war. One essay declared, "You imagine the ghost of George reading that with mild approval. He had been, above all, a man who valued order more than affection." The new reign brought rearrangements. Courtiers who had once thrived in the old king's favor found themselves displaced by the new. Ministers recalculated loyalties with the efficiency of accountants. The machinery of government turned again, indifferent to the cold body sealed in Hanover. Yet, beneath the protocol, something shifted. The relationship between Britain and its new dynasty, the uneasy marriage of island and continent, grew roots that would last for generations. The Hanoverian kings would rule England for over a century, their German accents softening into history. But the first of them would remain, in memory, a stranger. You stand one last time in the chapel where George I lies. Weeks have passed. The air is drier now. The candles replaced by lamps of oil. The marble floor is cold beneath your boots. Dust collects on the velvet drapery, and the scent of resin has faded to something faintly metallic, like old coins. Through the iron grate of the vault, you can just make out the outline of the coffin, dull gray. Edges softened by shadow. There is no crown here. No music. No movement. Only the sound of dripping water somewhere deep within the stones. They say the king's heart was buried separately, a continental custom, meant to divide reverence from flesh. A reliquary in Osnabrück holds it still, sealed in silver. The physicians had removed it on the day of embalming, recording the weight with neat, detached precision. Heart, 8 ounces. Brain, 24. Those numbers mean nothing now. The heart does not measure the measure of a man. Still, the detail stays with you. Perhaps because it is so brutally exact. Outside the palace, the world continues. Markets reopen. Ships leave the port of Emden, bound for London with letters of condolence wrapped in oilskin. The garrison fires a muted salute. The peasants in the countryside return to haymaking, their scythes glinting under the same indifferent sun that once warmed a king's face. Only the chapel keeps its darkness. Years later, when you pass through Hanover again, the Lineschloss looks different. The windows have been rebuilt, the moat filled, the banners changed, but you remember where the chapel door stood. And you pause. Inside, everything feels smaller. Dust has settled on the carved coats of arms. A faint smell of damp stone lingers. The guide who tends the place nods politely, unaware that you once rode in that rain-soaked procession. He points out the vault beneath your feet. George I, he says, as if reciting from a list. Buried here until the war destroyed the palace. You nod, though you already know the rest, that after the Second World War, his remains were moved to Herrenhausen, to rest with the other kings of his line. Bones beneath ruins beneath gardens. What remains of him now is geography and lineage. A line drawn from Osnabrück to Hanover, from Hanover to London, from father to son. A path of succession paved with breath and silence. The official portraits show a man stiff in brocade, powdered wig immaculate, eyes narrowed in patient disinterest. They cannot show the smell of the sickroom, the damp weight of the journey, the way a candle guttered on the moment of his last exhale. You remember those things because you were there. You remember how the road shimmered with rain and how the world refused to stop. In the end, what does a reign amount to? Decrees, marriages, treaties, wars avoided or postponed, a handful of laws that outlive the man who signed them. The body fails, the seal remains. The servants who witnessed it, people like you, become lines in forgotten ledgers, their handwriting fading into the same dust that claims the crown. When you think of George I now, it is not as a monarch but as a traveler, one whose last journey began in motion and ended in silence. A king without a country to die in. A man split between two homes, two tongues, and 2 centuries. The chroniclers will tidy his story into paragraphs. But you will remember the sound of rain on the coach roof, the trembling of the horses, and the strange calm after breath stops but before anyone dares to speak. That is the real inheritance of kings, not marble, not power, but the echo of the moment when movement ends. The chapel door closes behind you. Outside, the evening light lies thin and gold across the cobblestones. Somewhere in the distance, a bell marks the hour, slow, unhurried, as though time itself were paying its last respect. The air smells of rain again. You breathe it in and think how everything, sooner or later, becomes history. The flesh, the crown, even the sound of hooves fading down a road that no one remembers anymore. You do not see the ripple of history when it begins. It is too quiet for that. It moves like mist through corridors and signatures, through the shuffle of clerks who change one name for another on the mastheads of London gazettes. Yet in the weeks following George I's death, the air itself seemed altered. The empire he ruled did not break, but something invisible within it shifted, like the settling of a house after a storm. In Westminster, black cloth covered the gallery rails, and members of Parliament stood in somber rows while prayers were read for the departed king. The chaplain's voice trembled slightly when he reached the line. "Thou turnest man to destruction. Again thou sayest, 'Come again, ye children of men.'" The words echoed against marble, bounced off the gilded ceilings, and dissolved in the dust motes above their wigs. Outside, the carriages of the new court waited under gray skies, their wheels spattered with mud from the previous night's rain. You could smell the damp horsehair, the iron, the faint wax of mourning candles carried between houses. London observed its grief with the precision of a ledger. On June 25th, the official gazette announced the death and accession. Black ribbons adorned the arms of soldiers. Shopkeepers draped their windows. Theaters closed for the week. Bells tolled across the Thames, their vibrations traveling down alleys and across the water to Southwark, where chimney smoke bent in morning air. Yet within that orchestrated sorrow was an undercurrent of indifference. George I had been a foreign king, distant, practical, reserved, and the common people had never loved him. They respected his reign the way one respects a well-built wall. It holds. It does not charm. You walk those streets now in imagination, hearing the gossip blend with commerce. In Covent Garden, a fruit seller mutters that the king never spoke English properly. In a coffeehouse off Fleet Street, pamphleteers debate whether a man who ruled from afar could ever belong to the island he governed. One of them, a young writer with ink-stained cuffs, observes that perhaps kings should die where they are loved. Another replies that such men are seldom born to crowns. The conversation drifts into laughter, but something uneasy lingers beneath it, a sense that the monarchy itself has become spectral, an institution sustained by habit more than by presence. Back in Hanover, the morning felt different. The Germans had known him as elector long before the English knew him as king. To them, his passing carried the intimacy of distance crossed. Church choirs sang Jesu, Meine Freude with a sincerity absent in London's ceremony. Peasants left flowers at the gates of the Lineschloss. The scent of pine resin filled the streets where torches burned at night. It was there, not in Westminster, that the first Hanoverian was truly mourned. His legacy, though unspoken, ran deeper than his reputation. George I had done what English politics demanded and few monarchs could. He made the crown stable. After the convulsions of civil war, regicide, and the Jacobite threat, he gave the kingdom predictability. He trusted ministers more than monarchs usually dared, letting Robert Walpole craft the beginnings of cabinet government. He avoided foreign adventures that might bankrupt the treasury or test the patience of Parliament. And though caricaturists mocked his heavy German speech and dour expression, even they conceded that his thrift and discipline had kept Britain steady in a world of collapsing thrones. But for all his steadiness, he lived and died as a man between worlds. The English never forgave his accent, the Germans never quite understood his crown. He wrote letters in French, spoke to courtiers in Low German, signed treaties in Latin, and prayed in the Lutheran tongue of his childhood. At court banquets, he often sat in silence, lost in the sound of languages he did not command. The loneliness of power had a literal sound for him, voices he could hear but not answer. It is said that in his final years, he preferred hunting in Hanover to presiding over the politeness of London. The rhythm of hoofbeats more intelligible than Parliament. When you recall his end, the stroke on the road, the dying breath in his brother's palace, you realize how fitting that dislocation was. A king who spent his life in transit died in motion. Midway between two homes, the coach became his last throne, the road his last court. Even in death, he remained the bridge between two realms that eyed each other warily across the sea. After his burial, London newspapers printed reflections meant to comfort readers with the thought that the crown had passed, without convulsion or rebellion. The Daily Courant noted, with almost mathematical calm, that his late Majesty's life may be said to have been useful rather than splendid. That phrase, useful rather than splendid, clung to him. It is both epitaph and verdict. You think about usefulness, about the kind of endurance that builds nations but never earns affection. Perhaps that is the most haunting part of his legacy. He gave the English monarchy its modern shape by removing the romance from it. The idea of the sacred king died long before his body did. And in its place stood the constitutional monarch, measured, distant, restrained. The crown became a mechanism, and he the first to bear it knowingly as such. Yet even mechanisms hum with the echoes of the men who shaped them. In 1740, when Walpole himself died, his private papers recorded that George I trusted me when no one else did. It is an unadorned statement, without sentiment, but heavy with consequence. Without that trust, the balance between monarch and parliament might have collapsed. The quiet stability of 18th century Britain, the trade, the navy, the slow expansion of empire, sprang from that unassuming foundation. And so the man mocked as dull became, in the ledger of time, indispensable. Years roll forward, his descendants sit upon the same throne he once found alien. George II dies of a ruptured aorta while dressing for the day, swift. Undignified. George III goes blind and mad. George IV, obese and perfumed, wastes himself in silk and brandy. Each repeats some version of their ancestors' isolation. Power enclosed by ceremony. Loneliness gilded by duty. In this, the first Hanoverian left them more than a crown. He left them the quiet curse of detachment. You imagine returning, centuries later, to the place where his body was last moved, Herrenhausen. Its gardens reconstructed, its fountains restored. The air smells of clipped hedges and limestone dust. Beneath the carefully measured walkways lies the stone that bears his name. Tourists pass without noticing, their voices fluttering in a dozen languages. None of them mention Osnabrück or the wet road, or the candle that sputtered at his final breath. Yet the silence of that vault seems to shape the garden above it. As if the whole geometry of the place, its symmetry, its restraint, were drawn from the temperament of the man below. If you kneel close, you can see where time has dimmed the inscription. Georgievs Rex Primvsbritanniarum. The letters are shallow now, filled with dust and water. They do not shimmer, they whisper. You trace them with your eyes, not your fingers, because some boundaries are still royal. And as the sunlight moves, the shadows inside the carved grooves flicker, dark, then light, then gone. You remember the brand line we began with. You are not a tourist in time. You are a witness. Witness to the way a man can become a border between languages, between empires, between life and its own retelling. Witness to how death, once sealed in lead, continues to speak through treaties, portraits, and the quiet endurance of institutions. George I may have died on a road few remember, but every constitutional line of Britain still carries the echo of his reign, the rhythm of that coach wheel, the pulse between thunder and stillness. And perhaps that is history's strangest mercy. It allows the forgotten to govern the remembered. The road where George I fell is still there. It winds quietly through the German countryside, now bordered by trimmed hedges and electric poles. Cars hum where carriages once labored. The fields are green again, clean and ordinary, the kind of landscape that hides history beneath its calm. But if you stand there, between Delden and Nordhorn, where the soil dips slightly toward the river, you can feel the faint vibration of something older than the asphalt. A memory pressed into the ground, hooves, wheels, rain, and a man dying in silence. Local guides call it the King's Road. Few tourists stop, and fewer know why it bears that name. There is a small stone marker at the edge of the ditch, carved simply with Georg Ludwig, 1727. Moss creeps along the base, swallowing the year letter by letter. On certain mornings, when the mist is low, it looks less like a memorial and more like a warning of how easily motion becomes memory, how quickly breath becomes history. You stand beside it now. Imagine the sound of a carriage axle grinding under strain, the slap of reins, the cry of a groom calling, langsamer, slower, then the thud of something soft against wood. That's all it took, a single blow within the skull, a clot bursting like a dam, and the first Hanoverian king of Great Britain collapsing into eternity halfway between two realms. Every few decades, a historian or traveler writes about this place. In 1890, a local schoolteacher documented the exact field where the king's coach halted, measuring distances with the precision of reverence. In 1937, a British diplomat on holiday visited the spot and noted that the air smells of wet rye and axle grease. During the Second World War, when Hanover was bombed into ruin and the Lineschloss burned, someone remembered that road and wrote in a letter, "He died away from the fire." Thank God, even destruction found a kind of mercy in that thought. When the Lineschloss collapsed under Allied bombing in 1943, the royal vault cracked open. Dust, glass, and centuries of silence spilled into the air. The coffins inside were shaken but not destroyed. George I's lead shell dented. Its seams split slightly, releasing a smell that one soldier described as sweet metal and rainwater. They resealed it hastily. In 1957, when the palace was rebuilt, his remains and those of other Hanoverian monarchs were moved to the chapel at Herrenhausen, the gardens he had once walked in youth, among fountains and clipped lime trees, when kings still imagined permanence. It is fitting, perhaps, that his body returned to a garden. The Herrenhausen grounds were designed for order, paths measured by compass, hedges trimmed to geometry, water made to obey. Power here was visible in symmetry. Yet beneath those controlled lines lies the king who never fully mastered his own narrative. In the cool soil under sculpted fountains, the man who ruled two nations lies silent, unclaimed by either. You visit the chapel one gray afternoon. The air smells faintly of candle wax and damp limestone. A caretaker sweeps quietly near the door. The vault lies below, a rectangle of stone, simple and unadorned. A bronze plate bears his name, the Latin titles condensed to a single paragraph. No crown, no marble effigy, just the weight of earth above him. If you close your eyes, you can still hear the echo of that road, rain against the coach roof, the low murmur of servants, the moment when silence overtook all sound. What makes George I's story endure is not grandeur, but the ordinariness of death colliding with the machinery of monarchy. For all the pageantry of crowns and heralds, his end was painfully human, a sudden hemorrhage, a drooping hand, a final breath witnessed by frightened servants. It is the detail that collapses distance. A man choking on his own breath in the back of a carriage. The smell of leather and rain around him. Even kings return to that same smallness. Modern historians often call his death unremarkable. They prefer to discuss the policies he left behind, the rise of Walpole, the cementing of parliamentary sovereignty, the foundation of a new dynasty. But when you read their words after visiting Osnabrück, the abstraction feels hollow. Unremarkable, is not the word for a king whose last view was a blur of rain and horses, whose body crossed a continent to find peace, whose name still clings to a quiet road that refuses to forget. The past leaves traces not through grandeur but through endurance. The soil remembers pressure, the wind remembers sound. When you walk that road today, each step releases a faint percussion, as if the earth were exhaling centuries of waiting. You realize that history is not buried, it lingers, folded beneath grass and gravel, patient as grief. In Osnabrück, a plaque near the episcopal palace still marks the room where he died. The ceiling beams are new, but the walls are original, oak darkened by centuries of breath and prayer. The air inside is cool and faintly metallic, like a church crypt after rain. A small sign reads, in German and English, King George I of Great Britain died here. The 11th of June 1727. Visitors pass quickly, some snapping photos, others whispering to children who do not understand why anyone should care. Yet for a moment, as footsteps echo through the hallway, you can almost hear the soft rasp of breath that once filled this space. The trembling of a life trying to finish itself with dignity. You think about how fragile remembrance is. Without plaques, without stones, without the persistence of paper, this story would have dissolved entirely. The road would be just another road, the palace another building, the name another syllable, but history clings because we retell it, because we walk the same paths and feel the same chill of recognition. He was here. He breathed. He ended. Even now, 3 centuries later, the legacy of that moment hums quietly beneath modern Britain. The constitutional monarchy that still reigns, ritual without rule, ceremony without tyranny, owes its shape to the calm policies of the man who died on that road. He taught power how to behave inside limits. He showed a restless nation that stability could be as noble as conquest. He turned monarchy into endurance. When evening comes, the chapel at Herrenhausen closes. The caretaker locks the doors, and the garden falls into shadow. The fountains shut off, leaving only the whisper of wind in trimmed hedges. You linger by the gate, watching the last of the light fade from the gravel paths. Somewhere beneath those stones lies the man whose final heartbeat still echoes along the old Osnabrück road. And in that quiet moment, you understand something the history books never capture. The story of George I is not about power, but about passage. It begins with movement, a carriage rolling through rain, and ends with stillness. Yet the motion between those 2 points is the essence of history itself, a journey no crown can shorten. No empire can delay. You take one last breath of the damp Hanover air and look back toward the horizon where the road disappears. Every life, royal or not, leads there, to the border between language and silence, between remembrance and forgetting, between the living and the lived. And somewhere along that infinite road, a carriage wheel still turns in the dark. There is a sound that follows every death, long after the breath has stopped. It is not the wailing of mourners or the toll of bells, but something quieter, the rearranging of the world to fill the space where life once was. You hear it in the shifting of wood as a coffin cools, in the hollow hush of corridors where servants once stood waiting for orders that will never come. For George I, that sound stretched across 2 kingdoms. From Osnabrück to London, silence carried his name farther than any trumpet ever did. Years later, travelers on the same road would remark on how ordinary it was. No monument but a small stone. No chapel on the hill. The great procession had vanished into the earth, leaving behind only the memory of motion. That is the strange mercy of time. It erases spectacle first and the human afterward. All that remains are distances measured by loss. In Hanover, the vault at Herrenhausen stands cool and dark, a pocket of eternity beneath ordered gardens. You descend narrow stairs to where his coffin rests among those of his heirs, George II, George III, and beyond. The air grows heavier with each step, thick with limestone dust and centuries of breath that never left the stones. Light catches on the metal plates of the sarcophagi, dull gold against gray stone. There are no faces, no crowns, only names. Georgius Rex Primus Britanniarum. The Latin feels austere, stripped of warmth, yet in that simplicity lies a kind of truth. The further history travels from flesh, the cleaner it writes its lines. You kneel, because some places demand it. Here, beneath the earth, kings are indistinguishable from the servants who built their thrones. The bones beneath the metal have forgotten language, allegiance, and title. The heart, once removed, measured, and sealed, no longer beats for either England or Hanover. All divisions collapse in this shared stillness. The noise of politics fades. The pulse of empire, once loud and insistent, is now nothing more than a whisper in the dust. And yet, outside this quiet, his reign endures in ways few recognize. The monarchy that still stands, restrained, constitutional, symbolic, was forged in the absence he created. Before him, kings ruled. After him, they reigned. He turned divine right into human duty. By speaking little and trusting much. By letting ministers govern while he observed. George I created the modern blueprint for monarchy's survival. The crown became lighter, but more enduring. The price of stability was distance. And he paid it in full. You wonder if he ever sensed it, that his own silence would outlast his words. That by doing less, he would leave more. It's a paradox history rarely celebrates, that restraint can be revolutionary. That humility can be stronger than glory. In his lifetime, they mocked his reserve. In retrospect, it became wisdom. The English called him cold. The Germans called him cautious. But perhaps he was simply tired of thrones that consumed men whole, of crowns that turned hearts into ornaments. He had seen the waste of war, the vanity of monarchs who mistook themselves for gods. Maybe that is why his death was not theatrical. No balcony speech, no grand farewell, just the steady rhythm of wheels, rain, and breath turning to stillness. A mortal exit from an immortal institution. You return above ground. The gardens stretch in perfect geometry, hedges squared like the pages of an unwritten book. Fountains glimmer faintly under overcast light. You realize these gardens, designed for symmetry, are themselves a language of control, water tamed, nature disciplined, beauty ruled by proportion. How fitting that a king devoted to order rests beneath them. History rarely remembers the quiet architects. It prefers the flamboyant, the conquerors, the madmen, the saints. But civilizations survive not by their storms, but by their stillness. The same stillness George I carried like a burden, like armor, through every corridor of his reign. In London, his statues still stand in muted corners of parks and squares. Bronze, stern, unremarked, pigeons roost on his shoulders, and the rain traces pale lines down his face. The plaques describe his titles, not his solitude. Tourists pass without reading, yet in those statues is the echo of that road, the face set in composure, the eyes fixed ahead, unmoved by praise or complaint. Centuries later, when the monarchy faced new tempests, abdications, wars, the slow erosion of reverence, it endured by remembering him, by returning, consciously or not, to the model of the silent king, steady, opaque, unshaken. The institution learned from his absence how to survive scrutiny. To stand still is sometimes the most powerful form of motion. But legacy is not measured in endurance alone. It is also felt in the tenderness of small details. A scholar once wrote that when the Linischloss vault was opened after the war, they found his coffin undisturbed but for a small indentation along one side, the mark of water that had seeped in during the bombing raids. It smelled faintly of resin and tobacco. The record noted, and the seal of England remained intact. The detail is trivial, yet achingly human. The scent of preservation, of dignity maintained even in ruin. You imagine that coffin in the dark, the faint echo of rain filtering down through broken stone, history breathing through cracks, a life long ended, yet still resisting oblivion. That is what legacy truly is, not the applause of the living, but the refusal of the dead to disappear entirely. When you step out into the Hanover air again, Dusk has fallen. The sky is bruised with violet and ash. The first lamps along the path flicker to life. And the fountains resume their whisper. You look toward the horizon and picture the road stretching back to Osnabrück, the same curve of earth. The same ghosts of hoofbeats fading toward the edge of hearing. You think of all the travelers who will drive that road tonight without knowing whose breath once ended there. It no longer matters. History does not need recognition to endure. It survives in the act of being noticed. Even by one pair of eyes. And so, as the last light fades from the garden, you whisper a quiet benediction, not to the king, not to the crown, but to the silence itself. For it is silence that binds eras together, that bridges the living and the dead. Silence remembers when monuments forget. George I's reign began with suspicion, ended with indifference, and endured through balance. He was mocked for what he was not, a hero, a poet, a saint, but remembered for what he was. The still point that kept a restless empire from breaking itself apart. In his stillness, Britain learned to breathe. You close your eyes. The fountains hush for a moment. The air tastes faintly of rain, resin, and iron. The same elements that once filled a coach on a road between worlds. Every story ends this way. The sound of wheels. The slowing of breath. The return to quiet. And in that quiet, you hear it once more, the faintest rhythm. Not of power or glory, but of endurance. It belongs to no empire, no dynasty. It belongs only to time. You are not a tourist in time. You are a witness.